Look at this map. 54 countries, straight lines everywhere, borders that cut through deserts, rivers, mountains, in places where, frankly, there is no natural reason for a line to exist. Compare that to Europe. Europe's borders are messy. They wiggle. They follow rivers, mountain ranges, centuries of wars, treaties, and marriages between royal families. Every squiggle tells a story. Africa's borders often don't wiggle. Many of them are straight. And when a border on a map is straight, that's usually your first clue that something unusual happened here. Straight lines aren't drawn by people who live somewhere. Straight lines are drawn by people looking at a map from very far away. So that's the question I want to answer today. Why does Africa, a continent bigger than the United States, China, India, and most of Europe combined, have 54 countries, many of them with borders that look like they were drawn with a ruler? Because the answer isn't really about Africa at all. It's about a room in Berlin in the winter of 1884, where 14 countries sat around a table and divided up a continent they had barely set foot in. And once you understand what happened in that room, you start to see why so much of the instability we associate with Africa today, the civil wars, the ethnic conflicts, the coups, isn't some inherent African problem. It's a design flaw, one that was baked in on purpose. But there's an important nuance. Africa was never a blank canvas to begin with. Long before Europeans arrived with maps and rulers, the continent was already home to an enormous variety of societies. Kingdoms and empires like Mali and the Kingdom of Congo, long-standing political traditions in Ethiopia, coastal trading cities like Kilwa that connected Africa to Arabia, India, and beyond. Thousands of distinct ethnic groups, languages, and ways of organizing power. Some of these societies had clear borders. Many didn't. Influence often faded gradually. People moved. Trade crossed political territories. The modern countries we see on the map today, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, simply did not exist in their current form. Then Europe arrived. For most of the 19th century, Europeans mostly stuck to Africa's coastlines. Trading posts, resources, people. The interior was difficult. Malaria, terrain, and organized African states made deep control slow and costly. Then two things changed almost at once. Quinine gave Europeans a way to survive malaria. Steamships and repeating rifles gave them a massive military advantage. Suddenly, the interior became reachable. At the same time, European powers were racing each other for prestige, for raw materials, and for territory before a rival grabbed it first. Belgium's King Leopold II claimed a personal fiefdom in the Congo. France pushed east from Senegal. Britain wanted a corridor from Cairo to Cape Town. Germany, newly unified, wanted colonies of its own. This is what historians call the Scramble for Africa. It moved so fast and so chaotically that European leaders grew nervous they might stumble into war with each other over African land. So German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck did what European powers always did when they wanted to avoid killing each other over the spoils. He called a conference. 14 countries sent representatives to Berlin in November 1884. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and others. The United States even sent an observer. Not a single African leader was invited. Not one African kingdom or voice was in that room. This wasn't an oversight. Africans were not treated as stakeholders. They were treated as part of the territory being negotiated, like the rivers and the mineral deposits. Over about 3 months, these men sat with maps, often incomplete or outdated, and negotiated who got what. The main goal wasn't to create functional countries. It was to prevent European nations from going to war with each other and to formalize claims so everyone agreed on who owned what. The simplest tool they used was latitude and longitude. Straight lines, a ruler. Britain secured large stretches of East and Southern Africa. France took huge areas of West and Central Africa. Germany carved out territories in what is now Namibia, Tanzania, and Cameroon. Belgium's king personally acquired the Congo, an area roughly the size of Western Europe, largely as private property. By 1900, roughly 90% of the continent was under European control. Not every border was a pure ruler line. Some followed rivers or mountains, some built on earlier treaties or negotiations with African rulers, some shifted through later wars. The reality was messier than a single meeting in Berlin, but the core problem remained the same. The borders were drawn primarily for European political convenience, not for the people who lived there. Before colonization, Africa was home to thousands of distinct societies. The Yoruba, the Ashanti, the Zulu, the Buganda, the Somali, the Hausa Fulani, each with its own systems of governance, some sophisticated and long established. The colonial borders often sliced straight through them. The Somali people, one ethnic group, one language, one culture, were split across 5 different colonial territories: British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, and pieces absorbed into Ethiopia and Kenya. Or look at it the opposite way. Nigeria wasn't one people forced apart, it was hundreds of different peoples forced together. The Hausa Fulani in the north, largely Muslim, with centralized emirates, the Yoruba in the southwest, with their own kingdoms, the Igbo in the southeast, organized in a more decentralized way. 3 fundamentally different political and religious landscapes forced into a single colonial unit because it was administratively convenient for Britain. This pattern repeated across the continent. Groups with little shared history were merged. Groups that shared language, religion, and kinship were divided. And in almost every case, the people living there had no real say. Colonial powers also built infrastructure, railways, ports, administrative centers, designed mainly to extract resources and move them to the coast, not to connect African economies to each other. Those patterns still shape the continent's economic geography today. The consequences. When African nations began winning independence in the mid-20th century, Ghana in 1957, then a wave through the 1960s, they faced a trap. Redrawing the borders to better match ethnic and cultural realities looked terrifying. Almost every realistic change risked conflict because claims overlapped. So in 1963-64, the newly formed Organization of African Unity made a deliberate choice: preserve the colonial borders as they stood at independence. Not because those borders made sense, but because reopening every line looked even more dangerous. The colonial map was frozen in place. You can trace many of Africa's major post-independence conflicts partly back to this inheritance. And Nigeria's civil war in the late 1960s, when the Igbo-led Southeast tried to secede as Biafra. Rwanda's 1994 genocide, which had roots in how Belgian colonial administrators hardened a more fluid social distinction into rigid ethnic categories. Sudan's long civil wars, which eventually produced South Sudan in 2011, a British-drawn border that had lumped very different regions together with little attempt to build shared institutions. None of this means ethnic diversity itself causes conflict. Plenty of diverse nations thrive. The problem is when diversity is forced together by an outside power with little regard for building the political trust in institutions needed to make it work. And of course, borders alone don't explain everything. Post-independence leadership, Cold War interference, global commodity markets, geography, and internal political choices have all played major roles. African countries have never been passive. They have built institutions, economies, and political movements of their own. So when people look at a map of Africa and ask why there's so much conflict or instability, they're often asking a limited question. The better question is, what happens when outside powers draw the borders of a continent they don't live on, primarily to avoid fighting each other, using maps and rulers instead of deep understanding of the societies on the ground? The straight lines on Africa's map aren't a quirk of geography. They're the fingerprint of decisions made far away, decisions that were never intended to create permanent, cohesive nations. Africans have spent the decades since independence trying to build functioning countries out of boundaries that were never designed for that purpose. Geography itself also plays a role. Africa is vast. The Sahara, dense forests, and thousands of distinct cultural groups made a single unified continent unlikely even without colonization. The modern map is a mixture, part older history, part geography, part colonial competition, part post-independence pragmatism, and part historical accident. Borders are decisions, not natural features. They can change. South Sudan is proof of that. The map we see today is simply the current version. The next time you look at those 54 countries and those straight lines, don't just see borders, see the decisions behind them. Because Africa wasn't simply divided by lines on a map. Those lines became the framework around which modern Africa has had to build itself. And that is why the map looks the way it does today. If you want to understand how this same pattern of arbitrary borders shaped conflicts in other parts of the world, the Middle East, South Asia, let me know in the comments. There's a lot more here.